The brass had made their decision final. Women could fly transports, medevacs, even reconnaissance birds, but combat helicopters? The generals shook their heads in their climate-controlled offices sipping coffee, while thousands of light years away, soldiers bled into alien soil. Too physically demanding, they said. Too much G-force, too much stress. The neural interface required a certain kind of aggression, a killer instinct that their studies claimed women simply did not possess in sufficient measure. Captain Sarah Chen had heard it all before. She had heard it during basic training when her drill instructor told her she would wash out in a week. She had heard it at flight school when her test scores exceeded 90% of her male classmates, yet she was still assigned to cargo runs. She had heard it whispered in the ready rooms, shouted during arguments in the officers' club, and printed in official military doctrine that was somehow always under review but never changed. Now she sat in the cockpit of a massive transport hauler, ferrying supplies to forward operating base Carthage on the planet Viridian 7. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, was a decent man who never questioned her abilities, which made him rare in their service. Below them, the jungle canopy stretched in every direction, a sea of purple and green vegetation that hid countless dangers. The colonists who had first surveyed this world had called it paradise. The soldiers fighting the Kresh incursion now called it hell with pretty colors. The communications channel crackled to life. It was routine chatter at first, supply coordinators confirming delivery times, weather reports about an approaching storm system. Sarah adjusted their altitude, keeping the bulky transport steady through a patch of turbulence. She had been flying for 6 years, had logged more hours than most combat pilots half her age, and could thread a needle with a 100-ton aircraft if asked. But according to the military brass, she lacked something essential for combat duty. Marcus glanced at the tactical display, his expression shifting from bored routine to concerned attention. Small red dots had appeared on the screen, clustered together roughly 40 kilometers from their current position. Then more dots appeared, and more. The IFF system identified them as human forces, but their formation looked wrong. They were not advancing or holding defensive positions. They were contracted into a tight circle, the signature of a unit that was surrounded and fighting for survival. The radio exploded with desperate voices. Through the static and the competing transmissions, Sarah caught fragments of the situation. 3rd Battalion had been on a reconnaissance patrol when they stumbled into a Kresh breeding ground. Something intelligence had sworn did not exist in this sector. The aliens had swarmed from hidden tunnels, cutting off the battalion's escape routes and overwhelming their defensive perimeter. 500 soldiers were now trapped in a clearing, barely large enough to land 3 helicopters, with Kresh warriors pressing in from all sides. She heard the gunfire through the open channels, the distinct crack of human rifles mixed with the shrieking clicks of Kresh bioweapons. Someone was screaming for air support. Someone else was calling for immediate evacuation. A third voice, calmer but edged with desperation, was requesting any available combat helicopters to provide covering fire so the medevac birds could extract the wounded. Sarah checked her tactical screen. The nearest combat helicopter squadron was over an hour away, repositioning after a strike mission on the northern front. The medevac units were already in the air, but would not dare approach without fire support, not with the concentration of Kresh forces that the drones were detecting. Every second of delay meant more human casualties. She had seen the aftermath of Kresh attacks before, had carried the survivors back to base, their bodies torn by crystalline shrapnel and dissolving under the aliens' acidic ammunition. Marcus was already pulling up the combat protocols on his screen, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. They both knew what Sarah was thinking before she said it. Their transport was not a gunship. It had no missiles, no autocannons, no plasma batteries. It carried supplies, medical equipment, and replacement parts. But it did have something else, something that Sarah had noticed during their pre-flight inspection. In the cargo bay, strapped down among the ration packs and ammunition crates, were 6 anti-vehicle rockets. They were being transported to a forward repair depot, old-model munitions that the combat units had replaced with newer systems. The rockets were unguided, dumbfire weapons that required direct line of sight and a steady hand. They were also incredibly dangerous to fire from a transport aircraft that was never designed to carry live ordnance while in flight. Sarah made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She switched the radio to the emergency command frequency, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute clarity. She identified herself and her aircraft, gave their current position and estimated time to the combat zone. Then she informed the ground commander that she was inbound to provide fire support. There was a moment of confused silence on the other end. Then a colonel's voice, rough with smoke and exhaustion, came back asking for confirmation. Did she say fire support? From a transport? Was she insane? Sarah repeated her statement, adding that they carried anti-vehicle rockets and she was qualified to deploy them. The manual said nothing about which type of aircraft had to fire the weapons, only that the pilot needed proper certification. She had that certification, had earned it 3 years ago during a cross-training exercise that she had volunteered for while everyone else was on leave. The colonel did not argue. He did not have time for regulations or protocols. He had 500 people who would be dead in 30 minutes if something did not change. He transmitted the targeting coordinates and wished her luck. Sarah heard the unspoken words behind his authorization. He was giving her permission to try something that would probably get her court-martialed if she survived, and probably get her killed if she was unlucky. Marcus did not question the decision. He unbuckled and moved back into the cargo bay, using the safety rails to navigate through the lurching aircraft. Sarah increased their speed, pushing the transport's engines harder than recommended, watching the temperature gauges climb into the yellow zones. Through the cockpit windows, she could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and swirling with electrical discharge. They would have to make their run before the weather closed in and made flying impossible. Below them, 500 human soldiers fought for their lives, their ammunition running low, their defensive perimeter shrinking with each passing minute. They did not know help was coming. They did not know that a pilot who had been told she was unfit for combat had just made a choice that would either save them all or add one more tragedy to the war's growing list. Sarah checked her weapons panel, mentally calculating angles and approach vectors, preparing to do something that no transport pilot had ever attempted in the history of human warfare. The Kresh had no idea what was coming for them, and neither did the generals who had written those regulations. In the cargo bay, Marcus finished loading the first rocket into the improvised launcher, his hands steady despite knowing they were about to attempt something monumentally stupid. The transport roared through the alien sky, racing toward a battle that everyone had assumed was already lost. The clearing appeared through the canopy like a wound in the jungle, brown earth torn up by explosions and stained dark with blood. Sarah brought the transport down to 500 meters, low enough to see the desperate situation unfolding below, high enough to avoid the worst of the ground fire. The Kresh were everywhere, thousands of them forming a tightening noose around the human position. Their chitinous bodies reflected the afternoon sun in shades of oil-slick purple and black, moving with the coordinated precision of a hive mind. Through her targeting scope, Sarah could see individual soldiers firing from behind improvised barricades, their muzzle flashes tiny sparks against the overwhelming alien tide. Medical personnel dragged wounded fighters toward the center of the perimeter, where the casualties were stacking up faster than anyone could treat them. She watched a squad make a desperate counterattack to buy time for a machine gun team to relocate, watched 3 of those soldiers go down under Kresh fire before they covered 10 meters. Marcus had jury-rigged a launch system using cargo straps and a manual firing mechanism that he operated from the open bay door. His voice came through the internal comm system, steady despite the wind roaring past him at their current speed. The first rocket was loaded and armed. The second was ready to follow 30 seconds later. He had worked out a rotation that would let them put all 6 rockets downrange in less than 4 minutes if everything went perfectly. They both knew nothing ever went perfectly in combat. Sarah lined up her first approach vector, coming in from the southwest where the Kresh concentration was thickest. The transport was not built for combat maneuvers, but she had spent 6 years learning every quirk and limitation of these birds. She knew how to coax performance from engines that were designed for efficiency rather than speed, knew how to bank and turn a craft that handled like a flying warehouse. The manual said the maximum safe bank angle was 20 degrees. She pushed it to 35, feeling the airframe groan in protest as she swung around for the attack run. The Kresh noticed them now. Their anti-air organisms began launching spores that burst into clouds of organic shrapnel, living mines that detonated with proximity fuses grown into their biology. Sarah jinked and dodged, threading between the bursts, trusting her instincts and her experience. An alarm screamed as one spore burst close enough to pepper the transport's armored belly with fragments. She ignored it, holding the course steady for 3 more seconds until Marcus called out that he had firing solution. The first rocket streaked from the cargo bay trailing white smoke, its motor burning fierce and bright. Sarah had aimed for the thickest concentration of Kresh warriors, a mass of bodies that was preparing to overrun the human eastern flank. The rocket impacted dead center, its shaped charge designed to penetrate vehicle armor instead, punching through dozens of alien bodies before detonating. The explosion was orange and black, throwing Kresh warriors through the air like toys. The shockwave rippled through their formation, breaking their coordinated advance into chaos. On the ground, the beleaguered soldiers saw salvation falling from the sky in fire and fury. Their cheers came through the open radio channel, voices hoarse with exhaustion and renewed hope. The colonel was shouting for his units to exploit the gap, to push back while the enemy was disorganized. Sarah heard all of it while simultaneously calculating her next attack run, banking the transport hard to port while Marcus reloaded behind her. The Kresh adapted quickly, their hive intelligence processing the new threat and responding accordingly. More anti-air organisms burst from the ground, these ones larger and with better tracking capability. Sarah saw them coming on her threat display, saw the biological missiles arcing toward her transport with disturbing accuracy. She threw the aircraft into a diving turn that exceeded every safety specification, felt the hull shudder as stress cracks propagated through non-critical structural members. The proximity warnings shrieked in harmony with the stall alarm, but she kept control, pulling out of the dive barely 50 meters above the jungle canopy. The maneuver saved them. The Kresh biomissiles overshot, their primitive guidance systems unable to compensate for the sudden altitude change. They detonated harmlessly above the transport, raining organic debris across the treetops. Sarah leveled out and climbed again, setting up for the second attack run while her heart hammered against her ribs and sweat ran down her face despite the cockpit's climate control. Marcus called ready on Rocket 2. Sarah came in from a different angle this time, approaching from the north where the Kresh had established what looked like a command cluster. In her scope, she could see larger aliens directing the swarm, their enhanced cranial structures marking them as synapse creatures that coordinated the lesser warriors. Take out the leadership and the hive coordination would collapse, at least temporarily. It was basic tactics that worked the same whether you were fighting humans or insects. She compensated for wind drift and the transport's forward momentum, making microscopic adjustments to her heading while simultaneously monitoring 6 different threat indicators. Below, a Kresh warrior climbed onto something tall and launched itself at the passing transport, covering an impossible distance with powerful legs. It slammed into the starboard engine nacelle, claws scrabbling for purchase on the smooth metal. Sarah felt the impact through the controls, felt the engine's output drop by 15% as the creature tried to tear through the protective housing. Marcus saw it through the cargo bay's side camera. Without hesitation, he unstrapped from his safety harness and grabbed a rifle from the emergency weapons locker, using one hand to brace himself while the other brought the weapon up. He fired 3 controlled bursts, stitching rounds across the alien's torso. It shrieked and fell away, tumbling end over end toward the jungle below. Marcus was back at the rocket launcher 10 seconds later, reporting Rocket 2 ready as though nothing unusual had happened. The second rocket flew true, impacting the command cluster with devastating effect. The larger Kresh died in the explosion, their bodies more vulnerable than the warrior caste but infinitely more valuable to the hive's coordination. Sarah watched the effect ripple through the alien formation immediately. The precise coordinated assault patterns dissolved into disorganized aggression. Individual warriors continued attacking but without the unified timing that made them so dangerous. On the ground, the human defenders recognized the shift and pressed their advantage, their concentrated fire now able to focus on isolated enemy groups rather than being overwhelmed by coordinated waves. Sarah brought the transport around for the third pass, but the Kresh had learned. They were no longer clustering in convenient target groups. Instead, they spread out, making individual rockets less effective. Worse, they had repositioned their anti-air organisms to create an overlapping field of fire that Sarah would have to fly through to reach any valuable targets. She studied the tactical display, her mind racing through scenarios and solutions, calculating survival odds and acceptable losses. The storm front was moving in faster than predicted. Lightning arced between clouds and the wind was increasing, buffeting the transport with unpredictable gusts. In another 10 minutes, flying would become suicidal even without hostile fire, but 10 minutes meant at least 3 more rocket runs. 3 more chances to break the enemy siege and give the ground forces room to breathe. Sarah made her choice without conscious thought. The same way she had made the choice to come here in the first place. She was committed now all the way to the end. Marcus reported Rocket 3 loaded and ready. Sarah pushed the transport into a screaming dive that took them through the anti-air envelope. Before the crash organisms could track and fire, she launched the rocket from a near vertical angle, then immediately pulled into a climb so steep that the stall warning became a continuous shriek. The transport clawed for altitude on engines that were now redlined and overheating, and for 3 terrible seconds, Sarah was not sure they would make it. Then they punched through the top of the crash firing arc, and she rolled inverted to see the rocket's impact below. It hit a crash spawning cluster that intelligence had not even known was there. The explosion triggered secondary detonations as stored biomatter cooked off, creating a chain reaction that carved a burning scar across 200 meters of jungle. The psychological impact on the crash swarm was immediate and visceral. These creatures would die for the hive without hesitation, but watching their nursery burn triggered something primal that overrode tactical thinking. Large portions of the swarm disengaged from the human perimeter to protect the spawning grounds, suddenly making defense more important than offense. The colonel's voice came through the radio, urgent but controlled. The medevac helicopters were moving in now while the Kresh were distracted, using the chaos to extract the most critical casualties. He needed Sarah to keep the aliens occupied for another 5 minutes. Just 5 more minutes to get the wounded out. After that, the combat gunships would arrive and take over. 5 minutes was 3 more rockets, 3 more attack runs through the storm and the anti-air fire and the 1,000 things that could go wrong. Sarah acknowledged the request with a single word and lined up for pass number 4. The 4th rocket run took them through hell itself. Sarah approached from the east, using the setting sun behind them to blind the crash tracking organisms. But the aliens had evolved on a world with 3 suns and their vision spectrum extended far beyond human range. They saw her coming and filled the sky with spores. Each burst was a bloom of death, organic shrapnel that could shred aircraft hull like paper. She flew through the gaps between them, spaces that seemed impossibly narrow for a craft the size of her transport, making split-second decisions that relied entirely on instinct and experience. A spore detonated off the port wing, close enough that the explosion rattled her teeth and sent the transport into a momentary spin. Sarah compensated instantly, feeding an opposite rudder and adjusting engine thrust to bring them back on heading. The wing showed damage on her structural integrity display. Nothing critical yet, but the metal was fatigued and weakening. Another hit in that location would likely rip the entire wing section free. She filed the information away and focused on the immediate problem, which was keeping them alive for the next 30 seconds. Marcus called out targeting data. There was a Kresh-heavy assault cluster forming on the southern perimeter, preparing for a final push to break through the human lines. If they succeeded, the entire defensive position would collapse and the medevac operation would turn into a massacre. Sarah adjusted her approach, bringing the transport into a low-level pass that took them barely 20 meters above the tallest trees. At that altitude, the Kresh ground warriors could hit them with small arms fire, and she heard the distinctive sound of projectiles striking the hull, felt the transport shudder as something punched through the cargo bay floor. She held the course. Marcus fired the 4th rocket at point-blank range, so close that they felt the backblast inside the cockpit despite the reinforced bulkhead. The rocket covered the distance to target in less than a second, impacting the Kresh formation before their neural processors could register the threat. The explosion was massive, shaped charges and high explosives combining with alien biochemistry to create a fireball that engulfed dozens of the creatures. The shockwave hit the transport from behind, adding velocity they did not need and pushing them dangerously close to the tree line. Sarah fought the controls, using every bit of skill she had accumulated over 6 years of flying to keep them airborne. The starboard engine was coughing now, damaged by debris or maybe just pushed too hard beyond its design specifications. She had to compensate with the port engine while simultaneously dealing with the damaged wing that wanted to drop them into a spiral. The transport was barely holding together, systems failing across the board, but it was still flying and that was enough. Below them, the medevac helicopters were working frantically. She could see them on her tactical display, small green icons hovering over the battlefield like guardian angels, loading wounded as fast as human hands could move. Each helicopter could carry 8 casualties in standard configuration, 12 if they pushed it and ignored the weight restrictions. Simple math said they needed at least 40 trips to evacuate all the wounded, and they did not have time for 40 trips. The Kresh were already recovering from the latest attack, reforming their lines and preparing to resume the assault. Marcus reported Rocket 5 ready, but his voice sounded wrong. Sarah glanced at the cargo bay monitor and saw him slumped against the bulkhead, his flight suit dark with blood from a wound she could not clearly see. He was still functional, though, still working the loading mechanism with determination that overrode whatever pain he was feeling. She wanted to tell him to stop, to strap in and let her handle this, but they both knew that was not an option. 2 more rockets to go. 2 more chances to buy time for the soldiers on the ground. The storm hit them with its full fury. Rain hammered against the cockpit canopy so hard, Sarah thought the reinforced glass might crack. Lightning turned the world strobing white, and the wind threw the transport around like a child's toy. She fought to maintain any kind of stable heading while simultaneously trying to line up for the 5th attack run. Every instrument in the cockpit was screaming warnings at her, telling her that structural integrity was compromised, that engine temperature was critical, that hydraulic pressure was dropping and fuel flow was irregular. She ignored all of it. There was a target below that needed to be hit, and she was the only one in position to hit it. The combat gunships were still 3 minutes out, and 3 minutes might as well be 3 hours in the current tactical situation. She pushed the dying transport into another attack vector, this one almost suicidal in its directness. No fancy approaches or clever angles, just a straight run at the Kresh reserve force that was massing for what would likely be their final push. The aliens saw her coming, and threw everything they had at the transport. Spores filled the air so thick they looked like a solid wall. Bioprojectiles arced up from the ground, organic missiles that tracked on heat and vibration. Sarah flew through it all, accepting hits because there was no way to dodge them all, trusting the transport's armor and redundant systems to keep them flying just a little bit longer. She felt impacts all along the hull, heard Marcus grunt in pain as something came through the cargo bay wall, but he fired the 5th rocket. Even wounded, even with the aircraft disintegrating around him, Marcus sent that rocket downrange with perfect accuracy. It struck the Kresh reserve's dead center, the explosion scattering their formation and buying the humans below precious additional minutes. Sarah saw the effect immediately on the tactical display. The enemy advance faltered. The medevac helicopters used the opening to extract 3 more loads of wounded, rising into the stormy sky with their precious cargo, while defensive fire from the ground kept the Kresh at bay. The colonel's voice came through the radio, somehow calm despite everything happening around him. The gunships had arrived. She could see them on her display now, proper combat helicopters with missiles and autocannons, swooping in to take over the fire support mission. Her job was done. He was ordering her to break off and head for base, to get her damaged aircraft out of the combat zone before it fell apart completely. She acknowledged the order and began a gentle turn to the north. Every control input met with sluggish response from systems that were operating on failing backups and emergency power. Marcus called forward, his voice weak but determined. Rocket 6 was loaded. They had 1 more and there was a target. Sarah saw it on her display. A Kresh command organism that had positioned itself on a ridge overlooking the battlefield, coordinating the swarm through pheromone signals and bioelectric pulses. If they could take it out, the aliens would lose cohesion completely, giving the gunships free rein to systematically eliminate the remaining forces. But hitting it meant another attack run through the storm and the defensive fire, and her transport was held together mostly by prayers and Marcus's duct tape repairs. She looked at the tactical situation, at the medevac helicopters still working to extract wounded, at the defensive perimeter that was holding but just barely. She thought about those 500 soldiers who had called for help, and about all the military reviews that had declared her unfit for combat duty. She thought about every regulation she had already broken in the last 15 minutes, and about how 1 more broken regulation would not make much difference at her court-martial. Then she turned the dying transport around and lined up for 1 final attack run. The gunship squadron commander was shouting at her over the radio, demanding to know what she was doing, ordering her to leave the combat zone immediately. Sarah switched off the command frequency and focused on flying. The transport was vibrating so badly that her vision blurred, and she could smell smoke from somewhere in the engine compartment. Warning lights that had been yellow were now red, and several systems had simply stopped reporting status entirely. Their connections severed or their processors failed. She came in low and fast, using the terrain to mask her approach until the last possible moment. The Kresh command organism saw her too late, its massive body turning toward the threat just as Marcus fired the sixth and final rocket. The munition covered the distance in a heartbeat, its shaped charge punching through the organism's armored carapace before detonating inside its body cavity. The explosion was muted compared to the others, but its effect was profound. The command organism died instantly, and with it went the swarm's coordination. The Kresh forces broke. Not retreated, not regrouped, but actually broke and scattered. Individual warriors ran in random directions, some toward the humans, most away, their hive mind connection severed by the death of the command node. The gunships fell on them like wolves among sheep, their missiles and cannons making short work of disorganized aliens. The battle that had seemed hopeless 20 minutes ago was suddenly, miraculously turning into a human victory. Sarah tried to climb to a safe altitude, but the transport refused to respond. The starboard engine had finally given up completely, and the port engine was running on fumes and determination. She could feel the aircraft dying beneath her, feel the airframe coming apart as stress fractures propagated through weakened structural members. Sarah fought the dying transport with everything she had, using airspeed to compensate for lost engine power, and finding lift where physics said none should exist. The jungle below was unforgiving, all rocks and hardwood trees that would tear through the hull like tissue paper if they hit wrong. She needed flat ground, needed a clearing, needed a miracle. What she found was a dried riverbed, narrow and studded with boulders, but better than the alternatives. Presenting themselves with terrifying speed, she lined up on the riverbed while simultaneously dumping fuel to reduce fire risk and shutting down non-essential systems to prevent electrical fires. Marcus had strapped himself into the co-pilot seat, his medical training telling him that his wounds needed immediate attention, but his pilot training telling him that securing the cabin was more important in the next 60 seconds. They both worked their emergency procedures with the smooth coordination of professionals who had trained for this moment, even while hoping it would never come. The transport hit hard. Sarah had aimed for the smoothest section of riverbed, but at their descent rate even smooth ground felt like concrete. The landing gear collapsed immediately, struts that were only designed for gentle touchdown simply snapping under the impact force. The belly of the aircraft hit next, grinding across rock and sand, throwing sparks that looked like fireworks in the storm's darkness. The nose dug in and Sarah thought they would flip, but momentum carried them forward in a screeching slide that seemed to last forever. They came to rest against a massive boulder, the impact throwing them forward against their restraints hard enough to bruise despite the safety harnesses. For a moment there was only silence punctuated by the ticking of cooling metal and the drumming of rain on the broken hull. Then Marcus was moving, unbuckling and reaching for the emergency medical kit even though his own blood was still seeping through his flight suit. Sarah tried to stand and discovered her left leg was not cooperating, pain shooting through her knee when she put weight on it. The radio was dead, smashed in the landing or maybe knocked offline by battle damage accumulated during their attack runs. Sarah used the emergency locator beacon, activating the signal that would tell rescue forces where to find them. Then she helped Marcus into the cargo bay where the medical supplies were stored. The extent of his injuries became clear in the emergency lighting. Shrapnel from a Kresh bioprojectile had torn through his side, missing vital organs by centimeters but causing significant bleeding. He talked her through applying the trauma seal, his voice steady despite the pain, joking that this was not how he had expected to spend his afternoon. Outside, the storm raged. Through the shattered cockpit windows, Sarah could see lightning illuminating the jungle in brief flashes. Each burst of light showed alien shapes moving between the trees, Kresh warriors that had fled the battlefield, and were now wandering lost without their hive mind coordination. Some passed within meters of the crashed transport without seeming to notice it. Others investigated more carefully, their insectoid heads tilting as they processed sensory information that their damaged neural networks struggled to interpret. Sarah found a rifle in the emergency weapons locker, checking the charge and making sure the action was clear. Marcus had a sidearm that he was cleaning and loading with the mechanical precision of someone focusing on simple tasks to avoid thinking about complex problems like bleeding out in a crashed aircraft deep in hostile territory. They did not discuss their situation because they both understood it perfectly. Help would come, but it might take hours to reach them through the storm and the scattered Kresh forces. They needed to survive until then. The first alien to actually approach the transport was a smaller warrior, perhaps curious about the strange metal structure that had appeared in its territory. It climbed onto the hull, claws scraping against the damaged armor as it searched for an entrance. Sarah tracked it through the cargo bay's external camera, waiting until it moved near one of the emergency hatches before firing a burst through the thin metal. The alien shrieked and fell away, and for several minutes nothing else approached. The message was clear. The prey inside this metal shell could still bite. Marcus was fading. The trauma seal had slowed the bleeding, but not stopped it completely, and he had lost more blood than was safe. Sarah moved him to a more comfortable position, using cargo netting to fashion a support that kept pressure off his wounds. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes talking to her about his family back home, sometimes giving her technical advice about transport systems as though they were back in flight school. She kept him talking when he was awake, knowing that sleep might slide into something deeper and harder to return from. Hours crawled past. The storm began to ease, the rain reducing to a steady drizzle and the lightning moving off toward the eastern horizon. Sarah monitored the emergency beacon, hoping it was still transmitting through whatever damage the transport had sustained. She checked their defensive perimeter every few minutes, watching for Kresh that might be regaining their coordination as their pheromone networks re-established contact with scattered hive nodes. She rationed their water and did inventory on their ammunition, making calculations she hoped would never become relevant. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through clouds that hung low and oppressive. Sarah could see the jungle properly now, see the crash trail they had carved through the vegetation, see the Kresh bodies that littered the riverbed where the battle had scattered fleeing aliens. She could also see something else, movement in the distance that resolved into organized shapes. Her first thought was more Kresh, but then she recognized the formation pattern. Human forces, moving cautiously but deliberately toward their position. The rescue team arrived like professional soldiers, establishing a security perimeter before approaching the crashed transport. Sarah heard their challenges and gave the correct responses, identifying herself and Marcus, reporting their status and their situation. Medics came through the cargo bay door with practiced efficiency, assessing Marcus's condition and starting emergency treatment before moving him to a stretcher. A combat engineer examined the transport structure and declared it too damaged to salvage, recommending they strip useful equipment and then destroy it to prevent Kresh from studying human technology. A major wearing command insignia approached Sarah, his expression difficult to read. He asked if she could walk, and she demonstrated that she could, despite the throbbing pain in her knee. He escorted her to a command vehicle, a heavily armored transport that was serving as a mobile headquarters. Inside, she found the colonel from the radio, the man who had authorized her attack runs and accepted her offer of help, when regulations said he should have refused. He looked exhausted, his uniform still stained with the previous day's battle, but his eyes were clear and focused. The colonel outlined the situation. The battle had been won, though the cost had been heavy. Out of 500 soldiers, 87 were dead and another 140 wounded, some critically. But without Sarah's intervention, the battalion commander estimated total casualties would have exceeded 400. Every soldier who survived owed their life at least partially to 2 pilots in a transport aircraft who had done something impossible because it was necessary. The medevac pilots were calling her a guardian angel. The infantry soldiers were calling her other things, better things, words that soldiers reserved for the people who saved their lives. Then the colonel's expression hardened. There would be an investigation, he said. Multiple regulations had been violated, procedures ignored, safety protocols abandoned. The military bureaucracy would demand answers and probably demand punishment. Flying an unarmed transport into combat, deploying unguided rockets from an aircraft never certified for weapons release, ignoring direct orders to leave the combat zone. These were serious breaches that could not simply be overlooked. Sarah would likely face a court-martial, and Marcus as well if he survived his injuries. Sarah accepted this without complaint. She had known the consequences when she made her decision. Some things were more important than regulations, more important than careers or promotions or staying on the right side of military law. 500 soldiers were alive because she had broken the rules. That was a trade she would make again without hesitation. And if the generals wanted to punish her for it, Then she would accept that punishment with the same calm determination she had shown while flying into combat. But the colonel was not finished. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something more personal than his command tone. The investigation would come, he said, but so would something else. Every soldier who had survived that battle was filing commendation reports. The medevac pilots were writing her up for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The gunship squadron commander, who had watched her final attack run, was recommending her for the Medal of Valor. The paperwork would be extensive, detailed, and absolutely damning to anyone who thought women were unfit for combat aviation. The political implications would be enormous. 500 grateful soldiers and their families would want to know why their savior was being court-martialed for saving lives. The investigation began 3 days later in a sterile conference room at Fleet Command headquarters, far removed from the mud and blood of Veridian 7. Sarah sat at a long table facing a panel of 5 senior officers, their uniforms pristine and their faces professionally neutral. The lead investigator was a brigadier general named Richardson, a man known for his strict adherence to regulations and his belief that military discipline was the foundation of operational effectiveness. He opened the proceedings by reading the charges, a litany of violations that sounded damning when stripped of context. Operating an aircraft in an unauthorized combat role, deploying weapon systems from an uncertified platform, ignoring direct orders from superior officers, endangering military personnel through reckless actions. Each charge carried potential penalties ranging from reprimand to dishonorable discharge, and Richardson read them with the dispassionate tone of someone reciting established facts rather than debatable accusations. Sarah listened without interruption, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her expression calm despite the professional destruction being outlined before her. The evidence was presented next. Flight recorder data showing her approach to the combat zone, her attack runs through hostile fire, her continued operations despite damage and direct orders to withdraw, communications logs capturing her radio transmissions, her coordination with ground forces, her final defiant attack run after being ordered to leave, engineering reports documenting the damage to the transport, the improvised weapon system, the multiple safety violations inherent in her actions. It all looked damning, the kind of systematic rule-breaking that military courts were designed to punish. Then Richardson called his first witness, expecting testimony that would support the charges. Instead, he got Sergeant First Class James Morrison, an infantry squad leader who had been in that clearing. Morrison took the stand with the bearing of a man who had spent 20 years in the military and knew exactly how the system worked. He described the tactical situation, the overwhelming Kresh forces, the dwindling ammunition and mounting casualties. He described hearing the radio call that a transport was inbound with fire support and thinking it was some kind of mistake or cruel joke. Morrison looked directly at the panel as he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. He described watching that transport make its first attack run, seeing the rocket impact scatter the aliens that were about to overrun his position. He described the hope that surged through the desperate soldiers, the renewed determination that came from knowing someone was fighting for them. He described the subsequent runs, each one more dangerous than the last, the transport taking damage but continuing to fight. Then he described the final moment when the command organism died and the Kresh broke, turning certain defeat into unlikely victory. The sergeant finished his testimony with a simple statement. Captain Chen had saved his life and the lives of everyone in his squad. She had violated regulations, yes, but those regulations had been written by people who were not bleeding out in an alien jungle while monsters closed in from all sides. He would follow her into any battle, any time, and he trusted her judgment under fire more than he trusted the judgment of officers who made decisions from climate-controlled headquarters, light years from danger. Richardson tried to redirect, to get Morrison to acknowledge that regulations existed for good reasons, that military discipline required following orders even when they seemed inconvenient. The sergeant agreed with all of that in principle, then pointed out that Captain Chen had not violated orders for convenience or personal benefit. She had done it to save 500 lives, and she had succeeded. If the panel wanted to punish success while people who followed regulations to the letter presided over disasters, then maybe the problem was not with Captain Chen but with the regulations themselves. More witnesses followed, each one telling similar stories. the medevac pilot who had extracted wounded under the cover of Sarah's attack runs, the forward air controller who had coordinated targeting data with her, while simultaneously managing the entire battlefield, the company commander who had watched his defensive perimeter collapse until that first rocket bought them breathing room. They all acknowledged the violations, and they all insisted that those violations had been absolutely necessary and completely justified. Marcus testified from a wheelchair, his wounds still healing but his mind sharp, and his testimony devastating to the prosecution's case. He described the decision-making process, how Sarah had evaluated the situation and made a calculated choice rather than a reckless one. He detailed the improvised weapon system, how they had used existing equipment in a creative but logical way. He explained the technical flying required to execute those attack runs, the skill and precision that most combat pilots would struggle to match. He made it clear that what had looked like recklessness was actually highly skilled aviating performed under extreme conditions. The panel asked Marcus if he had tried to talk Captain Chen out of the mission. He smiled and said that would have been pointless. She had already made her decision based on a simple calculation. 500 soldiers needed help, and she had the tools and skills to provide that help. Everything else was secondary. The panel asked if he regretted his participation. Marcus looked at them like they had asked if he regretted breathing. He had helped save 500 lives. Whatever consequences came from that were worth paying. Richardson attempted to regain control of the narrative by calling expert witnesses on aviation safety and military protocol. A flight safety officer testified about the dangers of operating aircraft outside their design parameters. An ordnance specialist explained the risks of deploying unguided rockets from an uncertified platform. A command doctrine instructor outlined the importance of following orders to maintain unit cohesion and command authority. All of it was technically accurate, all of it supported the charges, and none of it addressed the fundamental question that the previous witnesses had raised. On the third day, the colonel who had commanded the ground forces testified. He brought something with him, a data pad containing 500 personal statements from the soldiers who had been in that clearing. He asked the panel's permission to enter them into evidence, and Richardson had no choice but to allow it. The colonel read selections at random, voices of gratitude and respect from people who had faced death and been given life by a pilot they had never met. Some were eloquent, some were crude, all were sincere. Then the colonel set down the data pad and spoke directly to the panel. He described his own decision to authorize Sarah's mission, knowing it violated protocols but understanding that protocols were tools for achieving objectives, not obstacles to success. He took full responsibility for that authorization and said that if the panel wanted to punish someone for the violations, they should punish him, but he also made clear that he would make the same decision again without hesitation, because the alternative was losing 500 soldiers to satisfy rules that were never designed for the situation they had faced. Richardson tried one final approach. He asked the colonel if he believed that allowing violations of regulations, even for good reasons, would lead to a breakdown in military discipline. The colonel considered the question carefully before answering. He said that military discipline existed to make units more effective, not less. Rigid adherence to rules that prevented effective action was not discipline, it was dogmatism. The military needed people who understood the spirit of regulations rather than just their letter, who could make judgment calls under pressure and accept responsibility for their decisions. The questioning concluded and the panel retired to deliberate. Sarah waited in an adjacent room with Marcus, neither of them speaking much. The verdict could go either way. They had clearly violated regulations, and the military had a legitimate interest in maintaining order and discipline. But they had also saved hundreds of lives and demonstrated capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about combat aviation. The panel had to weigh competing values and decide which mattered more. 2 hours later, they were called back. Richardson read the panel's findings in the same neutral tone he had used to read the charges. The violations were acknowledged and confirmed. Captain Sarah Chen and Lieutenant Marcus Webb had operated outside authorized parameters, deployed weapons improperly, and ignored direct orders. However, the panel found that these actions were taken in good faith to address an immediate tactical emergency where following standard protocols would have resulted in catastrophic loss of life. The panel's recommendation was unprecedented. Rather than punishment, they recommended formal commendations for both officers. They also recommended an immediate review of combat aviation regulations, specifically the restrictions on women in combat helicopter roles. The evidence demonstrated that these restrictions were based on flawed assumptions and that qualified female pilots should be evaluated on their individual capabilities rather than categorical exclusions. The panel forwarded their findings to Fleet Command with a strong recommendation that policy changes begin immediately. Sarah absorbed this information with the same calm she had maintained throughout the investigation. 6 months passed before the full impact of that day in the jungle became clear. Sarah spent the first month recovering from her injuries and catching up on sleep she had lost worrying about the investigation. The second month brought unexpected fame as news services picked up the story of the transport pilot who had fought like a gunship. She did dozens of interviews, always uncomfortable with the attention, always redirecting praise to Marcus and the soldiers who had actually fought the ground battle. But the story resonated with people across human space, becoming a symbol of something larger than one emergency combat action. The third month brought the policy changes. Fleet Command announced a comprehensive review of combat aviation assignments, removing gender-based restrictions and replacing them with performance-based evaluations. Any pilot who met the physical and mental requirements could now qualify for combat helicopters, gunships, or any other aircraft in the military inventory. The announcement was careful to frame this as a correction of outdated policies rather than admission of past discrimination, but everyone understood what it really meant. The door that had been closed for decades was now open. Applications from female pilots flooded the combat aviation training programs. Some washed out, unable to meet the demanding standards or simply deciding combat flying was not for them, but others excelled, proving they had the same capabilities as their male counterparts when given the opportunity. Within 3 months, the first class of female combat helicopter pilots graduated and deployed to operational units. They flew missions over hostile territory, performed airstrikes and reconnaissance, and generally demonstrated that the only thing that had been holding them back was artificial restrictions rather than natural limitations. Sarah received orders, assigning her to the Combat Aviation Training Center as a senior instructor. It was a significant promotion and a clear message from Fleet Command. They wanted her teaching the next generation of combat pilots, sharing the skills and judgment she had demonstrated under fire. Some saw it as a reward for her actions. Others whispered it was a way to keep her visible while limiting her operational role. A compromise between honoring her accomplishments and protecting the institution from more rule-breaking. Sarah did not particularly care about the politics. She saw an opportunity to influence training doctrine and ensure future aviators learned from her experience. Marcus recovered enough to return to flight status, though his injuries left him with limitations that ended his career as an active duty pilot. Instead, he accepted a position in aircraft systems development, using his experience to improve transport designs and safety systems. He worked closely with engineers to develop better weapon integration options for non-combat aircraft, ensuring that if another pilot faced Sarah's situation, they would have proper tools rather than improvised solutions. His technical expertise and combat experience made him invaluable to the development teams. The real changes happened gradually in ways that statistics and policy documents could not fully capture. Female pilots joined squadrons and proved themselves in combat, their gender becoming less relevant with each successful mission. Male pilots who had been skeptical found themselves flying wing with women whose skills matched or exceeded their own. The culture shifted not through mandates or diversity training, but through shared experience and mutual respect earned in difficult circumstances. It was not perfect or complete. Prejudices remained, but the trajectory was clear. On the anniversary of the battle at Viridian 7, Sarah stood in front of a memorial ceremony honoring the 87 soldiers who had died in that clearing. 500 survivors attended, along with their families and the crews who had evacuated them. The speeches talked about sacrifice and courage, about the bonds formed in combat and the debt owed to those who gave their lives defending humanity against alien aggression. Sarah listened from the crowd, just another attendee rather than the guest of honor, which was how she preferred it. After the ceremony, soldiers approached her. Some wanted to shake her hand or take photographs. Others just wanted to say thank you in person, to connect a face with the voice they had heard over the radio during their darkest moment. She spoke with each one, learning their names and hearing their stories about what happened after that day. Some had left the military and returned to civilian life. Others remained in service, carrying forward the lessons learned in that jungle clearing. All of them remembered, and all of them made sure she knew that what she had done mattered. An older woman found Sarah as the crowd dispersed. She introduced herself as James Morrison's mother, the sergeant who had testified at the investigation. Her son had been killed 4 months ago in another battle on another world, she said, but before he died, he had written her a letter. In it, he talked about the day a transport pilot saved his life, and how that experience changed his perspective on what was possible when people refused to accept limitations. He had faced his death with courage learned from watching someone else demonstrate that same courage under fire. Sarah did not know what to say to that, so she just listened as the woman talked about her son and his service and his belief that some things were worth dying for. Then the woman thanked Sarah for giving her a few extra months with her son, for the letters and video calls that would not have happened if he had died in that clearing. She pressed something into Sarah's hand, a small patch that Morrison had worn on his uniform showing his unit insignia. She said her son would have wanted Sarah to have it, as thanks from a soldier to the pilot who gave him a second chance. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her quarters looking at the patch and thinking about all the changes that had cascaded from one decision made in the cockpit of a dying transport. She thought about the female pilots now flying combat missions, the lives that would be saved by having more qualified aviators available, the young women who now saw military aviation as a viable career path. She thought about Morrison and the others who had survived that day only to die later, and about the complex mathematics of war, where victory and loss were often impossible to separate clearly. Marcus called to check on her, sensing correctly that the memorial ceremony would leave her reflective and melancholy. They talked about the changes they had seen, the progress made, and the resistance remaining. He told her about new transport designs incorporating hardpoints for defensive weapons, about improved emergency systems based on lessons from their crash landing. She told him about her advanced students, pilots who were learning combat tactics from someone who had actually flown combat missions in an aircraft never designed for fighting. They were both finding satisfaction in teaching and development work, in shaping the future rather than just responding to the present. The conversation drifted to what might have happened if they had followed regulations that day. If Sarah had reported her inability to provide support and continued with her routine supply delivery. Would the battalion have been overrun completely? Would different combat assets have arrived in time? The tactical simulations suggested total collapse within 40 minutes, which meant most of those 500 soldiers would have died. But simulations were not reality, and reality had too many variables to know for certain. What they did know was that their choice had worked, and that 500 people had gone home because of it. Sarah ended the call and prepared for the next day's training schedule. She had a class of new combat helicopter students, including 3 women who would be among the first to complete the full course under the new policies. They were talented and determined, facing extra scrutiny but rising to meet it. She would teach them everything she knew about flying in combat, about making decisions under pressure, about when to follow rules and when to break them in service of larger objectives. She would teach them that regulations were tools, not chains, and that the mission always mattered more than procedure. As she reviewed the training syllabus, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The generals who had written those original restrictions were mostly retired now, their certainties about women and combat aviation proven wrong by data and experience. New leaders were making new policies based on evidence rather than assumptions. The military was changing, slowly and imperfectly, but changing nonetheless. And somewhere in that change was the echo of 6 rocket runs made by a transport pilot who refused to accept that helping was impossible. The war against the crash continued across a dozen worlds, the conflict grinding forward with the terrible momentum of interstellar warfare. More soldiers would die. More pilots would face impossible choices. More desperate situations would demand exceptional responses. But now there were more tools available. More voices contributing solutions, more perspectives informing decisions. The military was stronger for being more inclusive, more effective for using all available talent rather than limiting itself based on outdated ideas about who could do what. Sarah turned off the lights in her quarters and settled in for sleep. Tomorrow she would teach young pilots how to fly and fight and survive. She would share the lessons earned in smoke and blood, the knowledge purchased with broken regulations and a crashed transport.